We all sometimes think about death, but if thoughts constantly revolve around this topic, panic fear arises. This is no longer the norm. Each person has their own perception of death. Someone tries not to think about her, and someone indifferently perceives any mention. But there are people for whom any encounter with death causes panic and anxiety. Death is the most mystical and mysterious aspect of human life. Many people are interested in what happens after death, but it is the unknown that makes people afraid of it. This fear sometimes leads to the fact that people do not live a full life, limiting themselves in their abilities. The disease took away a friend from us, and the man was gone. Such words are usually pronounced over the grave. But does this correspond to reality? After all, if our life ended with the onset of death, then what is such a life worth? If, with the end of life, a person ceases to exist, then why should we care about the future, strive for the ideals of truth and goodness, the concept of duty? In this case, is it possible to justify the advantages of these ideals in comparison with selfish aspirations? Here we can cite various opinions of philosophers and scientists about immortality. Thus, the philosopher William James, who died in 1910, was so confident in the immortality of man that he promised his friends to find an opportunity to communicate spiritually with them after his death. Yes, one can be ironic about the words of William James, but it is better to try to explain what a person's life is like after physical death. Let's turn to the law of energy constancy. According to this law, energy does not disappear anywhere. In addition to this, we can recall important scientific discoveries, for example, X-rays that have made their own adjustments to this law, because it became obvious that matter can eventually turn into energy. At the same time, it is necessary to pay attention to the fact that energy is the beginning of matter. Therefore, these elements of matter can decompose into energy without a trace. It is necessary to consider energy as a single source that gives rise to everything material and spiritual, and consider energy as a single entity in the universe. What happens to a person after death? Considering this question, Russian academician Vladimir Bekhterev describes the fate of the physical body and personality of a person after the end of life. The physical body ceases to exist. It breaks down into simpler substances. During this decay, some part of the energy becomes free to become the basis for other forms of life, for example, the plant world. He noted that a new physical life always begins thanks to a part of something else. But what happens to human consciousness? Consciousness, or its mental activity, it is the same expression of energy. This means that the law of conservation of energy, which is generally recognized by the scientific community, should also work here. According to the scientist, in the case of our consciousness, this law works as follows. Any step, human action, sigh, smile, look, gesture, thought do not disappear without a trace. All this somehow affects the person himself, other people, and the world around him in the future. It turns out that there is a continuous cycle of energy between people. The presence of this cycle is an indisputable fact that with the completion of his physical life, a person continues to live spiritually. Because everything that a person declares in the course of his physical life is pumped from generation to generation, continues to live in people's minds, influencing their personalities and being their eternal motivating stimulus. Due to the mutual influence of people, the energy of the immortal spirit manifests itself in other people, their actions, words, even in their facial expressions. Thus, is it possible to declare that a person's personality is mortal? Of course not. A person's personality is immortal. There is no death. From this it turns out that each person is the successor of the past generations and the creator of the next. None of us has the right to consider our work fruitless and ourselves powerless, because each of us gives birth to the future. And the one who is afraid of death is the one who separates himself from the whole world, perceives himself as something independent and whole, disappearing with the onset of death. In order not to be afraid of death, one must remember the immortality of the individual and engage in creative work for as long as fate allows. The fear of death and extremity is one of the basic foundations of psychotherapy. There are 4 of them in total: the imperfection of the world, loneliness, fear of death, and the lack of global meaning. In psychology, the fear of death is a complex of anxious feelings about one's own limb or about the limb of loved ones, aimed at preservation. People are afraid to die because this fear is necessary for survival. It is probably impossible to call it just an instinct, but in general, most living organisms tend to avoid unpleasant and dangerous influences. This allows them to stay alive longer. At first, at birth, the child does not know that he will die sometime. His basic fear is the fear of separation, of losing a caring adult nearby. When no one approaches the child for a long time, he gets scared and screams, because this is a strong experience. Then the child learns that his parents are older than him, that one day they will die. Culture informs the child about this through fairy tales, where there are stepmothers, murdered fathers or brothers. Then he sees dead butterflies, dead mosquitoes. Sometimes children encounter the death of pets, so the child gradually learns that he himself is mortal. This is usually a strong experience that occurs at the age of 4 or 5. Most of the children react negatively to this. They report that they will never die, forbid their parents to die, but gradually they get used to it. Every culture has its own ways of dealing with death. If we talk about the Christian system, which covers most of the people, then funerals and then commemorations for 9 days, 40 days, and a year correspond to the normal stages of grief and mourning completion. From the point of view of evolutionary biology, the mechanisms that protect us from self-mutilation are important for survival and the transmission of genes to descendants. Let's say there is a widespread fear of heights among people, because if you see a chasm in front of you, you better stop moving towards this chasm. This feature is found even in childhood. It helps people not to fall from a height, survive, reach reproductive age, and leave offspring. The eternal question is, what is primary in a person, social or biological? Both are important. Something is inherent in nature, something is formed depending on how a person develops in society. The social overlaps with the biological, but the basic fears of specific threats that can lead to death are present in us from an early age. This can include real momentary threats in the form of predators, darkness, something hot, sharp, high. Fears that arise in a person not in early childhood, but a little later, become a consequence of the brain's ability to form associations, build cause and effect relationships. Roughly speaking, a person has been subjected to a certain stimulus and, as a result, has found himself in a state where innate detectors signal to him that he has done wrong. He may be in pain or cold, he may feel fear. When a person finds himself in a state of stress, his brain automatically tries, after analyzing previous experience, to understand what led to this deplorable situation. In many cases, this is a very important mechanism that helps us learn and identify real and potential threats that were difficult to foresee 1,000 years ago when our ancestors evolved. Today, the fear of death permeates everything around. These charms in cars, spitting over your shoulder, health notes in churches, religiosity, superstition, magical thinking and everyday mysticism in general are built on the erroneous idea that a person has power over death and can influence it if he turns to a set of rituals. And such a desire is understandable. Each of us was born into the unknown, which is death. Moreover, none of us chose whether to be born or not. If we discard all the theories about hell, heaven, time spaces, reincarnation, and so on, then we get one thing. Entering a conscious age, everyone understands that sooner or later they will die. But what is dying? What feelings will be at death? And most importantly, what will happen to your consciousness with everything you have acquired is unknown. At the same time, culture teaches us to look at death in a sharply negative way, to perceive it as the apogee of all the most terrible things. You can't joke about it. You can't actively discuss it. However, many cultures have treated very differently. In ancient Egypt, death was considered a continuation of life. In Buddhism, there is a practice of meditations entering death to prepare the body and spirit for this moment. And in Mexico, the deceased are escorted to their last journey with songs and dances. To many, the interest in the topic of death seems pathological. We do not want to admit that we are not only individuals, but also a biological mass that is doomed to disintegration. For us, death is exactly what makes life so valuable. We begin to die as soon as we are born, and no matter how long we live, it will most likely seem to us that this is too little. That is why you need to be able to take something out of every day, some kind of meaning, because any day may be the last. But even with death, life does not end. Another thing is that we expect the resurrection of the dead, because the soul without a body is not completely complete. A person consists of 3 parts: spirit, soul and body. It took Christ 3 days to go through death, after which he was resurrected. Of course, we will need more, but the time is not so important, because there is no concept of time beyond the threshold of death. But there is still a problem of death taboo even among Christians. It arises from lack of faith and lack of education in terms of Christian teaching. Time has done its job, and now the perception of old age, and with it death, is distorted. Previously, old age was perceived as a period of wisdom, when a person evaluates everything with a high scale of values, which he acquired after going through the experience of life. In old age, a person prepares for death. He is concerned about how he will appear before God. He will need to be responsible for his deeds, both good and evil. Now, old age has become perceived as infirmity, as dementia. Everyone strives to preserve eternal youth, and of course, along with the fear of old age, there was a fear of death. Hence the taboo. People live one day. They think that they need to live only to satisfy the needs of their flesh, but they completely forgot about the soul. They believe that everything stops with death and prefer not to think about it. At one time, the pagans, the same Greeks and Romans, despised death, but not because they thought that beyond the grave they would continue to live. They told themselves that they had to live for future generations. It resembles the psychology of an animal that lives only for procreation. Gradually, thought developed and philosophers came to the conclusion that a person is an individual. And then the question arose, if you are an individual, then why should everything end with your death? It was a great revelation for the pagans when they saw Christians calmly going to their deaths. So they know some secret, so they have access to something that we don't know about. And Christians had Christ, who rose from the dead and gave us all the confidence that our lives would continue beyond the grave.